Why do we live in a culture where people think the loudest voice always wins, when in truth, silence often cuts the deepest? In an age of oversharing and constant posting, is disappearing quietly the most radical and powerful move left? Society tells you to fight back when you're disrespected. But what if the greatest revenge isn't revenge at all? It's walking away with dignity. Welcome to StoicCraft, the channel where timeless Stoic wisdom meets the struggles of modern life. Here, we don't just talk philosophy. We forge tools you can use to reclaim your peace, your strength, and your self-respect. What if I told you that the most powerful response to disrespect isn't noise? It isn't dramatic words. It isn't some carefully crafted speech that leaves the room silent. No, the sharpest blade you can carry is silence itself. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Yet what most people never teach you is this: how to not react, how to vanish with dignity, how to detach without bitterness, how to let your absence become the most piercing response of all. Because when someone disrespects you, your instincts scream for retaliation. Every part of you wants to defend yourself, to prove them wrong, maybe even to humiliate them just enough so they never dare again. But Stoicism points to a deeper truth. The ultimate power isn't in what you say, but in what you silently remove: your energy, your presence, your emotional availability. This isn't about turning the other cheek in some naive, passive way. It's about mastering a kind of silence that shakes their soul, a silence that forces them to confront their own shadow. Epictetus also reminded us, no man is free who is not master of himself. And so if you've ever been disrespected, overlooked, or underestimated, this message is for you. Together, we're going to explore 5 silent moves, quiet, disciplined acts that will make those who crossed you regret it deeply, without you ever needing to raise your voice. And if this already resonates, take a moment, like this message, share it with someone who needs strength, and leave a comment with your own silent power move. Because true power doesn't need permission. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It only requires presence. And today you reclaim yours. Silent. Move 1. Withdraw access. Without explanation, there comes a moment, subtle, quiet but decisive, when you realize the most powerful thing you can do isn't argue, isn't explain yourself one more time, and isn't shouting your pain until someone finally understands. The most powerful thing you can do is stop showing up, not out of revenge, not to prove a point, but because you finally see a truth most people will never grasp. Your energy is not public property. When someone repeatedly disrespects you, they're not just crossing a boundary. They're depending on your silence to keep doing it. They count on your patience. They count on your kindness. They assume your emotional labor will always be there, waiting for them. They've built their chaos on the assumption that you'll keep carrying the weight. That's why withdrawal, complete, silent, unannounced, cuts deeper than any words ever could. Epictetus, the Stoic master of inner freedom, believed strength isn't found in controlling others, but in mastering yourself. He taught that suffering doesn't come from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. And so when you quietly withdraw, not angrily, not dramatically, but calmly and decisively, you flip the script. You refuse to play the role they've written for you. You shift the dynamic in a way they cannot predict. You're not being passive. You're not sulking. You're practicing what Epictetus would call conscious suffering, choosing principle over chaos. By removing their access to your presence, you force them to confront the one thing they've been avoiding all along: themselves. Most people live in predictable emotional loops. They expect you to argue. They expect tears, drama, explanations, because those reactions give them power. But when you disappear from that script, you create a silence that becomes unbearable. Suddenly, there's no one left to manipulate, no one to perform for, no one to blame. And that void, that mirror, is what disturbs them most. It's not your confrontation that shakes them. It's your absence. Because your absence becomes a mirror, cold, unflinching, undeniable. A mirror that doesn't shout or accuse, it simply reflects. And without your words clouding the air, they're forced to see their own actions with painful clarity. Here's where Stoicism becomes not just philosophy, but practical power. By walking away without spectacle, you rise above the noise. You're not playing petty games or seeking revenge. You're protecting your peace. You're reminding yourself that your presence is a privilege, not an entitlement. Epictetus told us to keep company only with those who uplift us, those who call forth our best. When someone continually fails to meet that standard, Stoicism doesn't tell you to fight harder for their attention. It tells you to leave quietly, carrying only your dignity, to remove the emotion and hold onto the principle. And yes, it's hard, especially when the disrespect comes from someone close, a friend, a sibling, a partner. You'll crave closure. You'll want to explain. You'll ache for them to finally understand. But this is where you learn the difference between ego and wisdom. The ego longs to be understood. Wisdom longs for peace. And the Stoics chose peace, even when it hurt. Why? Because the pain of detachment is temporary. But the pain of staying where you're not valued corrodes you slowly. You may think that disappearing makes you weak, that by walking away you're letting them win. But Epictetus would challenge that. He'd ask, if someone has harmed you, why add to the injury by remaining entangled? He'd be right. By staying, you become complicit in your own disrespect. By leaving, you reclaim sovereignty over yourself. Your absence is not cruelty, it is preservation. You stop performing endless emotional labor for people who refuse to grow. And here's the deeper truth. When you walk away without a single explanation, you are remembered differently, not as angry, not as broken, but as someone who had the strength to say nothing and still be heard. Over time, silence begins to echo louder than any final conversation ever could. While they expected you to beg, you disappeared. While they assumed you would eventually come running back, you never turned around. And in that haunting silence, regret begins to take root. Not because you punished them, but because you finally chose to value yourself more than their approval. Think about how many times you stayed longer than you should have, clinging to hope that they might change, waiting for the day they'd finally recognize your worth, convincing yourself that your patience would somehow pay off. And now, ask yourself honestly, where did that lead you? If you strip away the illusions, the answer is exhaustion. The waiting drained your energy. The hope chipped away at your dignity. Stoicism offers a different path. It reminds you that you owe no one your peace, that the only person who must fully understand your choices is you. Walking away isn't quitting. Walking away is leveling up. That's the essence of the first silent move. Withdraw access. No long speeches, no dramatic exits, just stillness. Let silence carry the explanation for you. Because the moment they realize they no longer have access to your time, your mind, your soul, that is when the real consequences begin. It isn't revenge, it's evolution. It isn't bitterness, it's boundaries. And now that you see this, clearly it's time to go deeper, because withdrawal is powerful, but it is only the beginning. Once you've stepped back, you can't just remain still. You must rise in private. That leads us to silent move 2. Level up in private. One of the most misunderstood forms of power is growth in silence. In a world obsessed with proving, hosting, and performing for validation, choosing to evolve privately is not only rare, it's unsettling, even threatening, especially to those who once disrespected you. Because here's what most people overlook: the ones who doubted you, mocked you, dismissed you. They were counting on your wounds to keep you visible, predictable, and emotionally accessible. They relied on your need to explain yourself. They fed off your tendency to react. They expected you to keep orbiting around their moods and their opinions. But what happens when you suddenly stop showing up the way they expect? What happens when your life quietly moves forward and you don't announce a thing? Epictetus taught that everything external, praise, status, criticism, even disrespect, lies beyond our control. What is within our control is our inner world, our choices, our direction. And when you decide to pour your energy into your inner life rather than trying to fix the outer one, you step into true freedom. That is the beginning of Stoic transformation. And make no mistake, people notice. They may pretend not to, but they feel it. Because suddenly their drama no longer dictates your attention. Their moods no longer pull your strings. You've stepped into your own gravitational field, and it unsettles them in ways they can't put into words. At first, they'll convince themselves it's temporary. You'll come back, they'll think. You always have. But Stoic discipline isn't a phase. It's a shift, and when that shift becomes consistent, their certainty starts to crumble. You're not posting your next move for the world to see. You're not clapping back with sarcastic remarks. You've simply removed yourself from the emotional stage. They used to dominate, and that silence, instead of fading, grows heavier with time, because now it isn't just absence. It's transformation, not loud, not for applause, but inward, steady, real. This is what Epictetus meant when he spoke about strength in adversity, the ability to hold your peace when others expect you to perform, to sharpen your mind while others gossip, to choose substance over shallow validation. While they wait for your return, watching closely for any crack in your resolve, you're building, you're reading, you're reflecting, you're pouring into your health, your goals, your growth. You're planting seeds in silence that will bloom long after they stop paying attention. And here's what unsettles them most. They can no longer categorize you. The version of you they once controlled no longer exists. You don't argue like before. You don't rise to the bait. You don't even meet their gaze with the same energy. Your attention has been anchored elsewhere, in your growth, in your peace in your future. And that unpredictability becomes psychologically destabilizing to anyone who thrived on your predictability. Epictetus believed that true freedom is the only worthy goal in life. And this is what freedom looks like: moving in silence, growing in depth, refusing to be pulled back into the shallow drama of others. This isn't about pretending you're unaffected. It's about choosing where to place your focus. You are not hiding. You're healing. You're not ignoring them. You've simply redirected your energy toward what matters. And here's the crucial part. You didn't do this for revenge. You did it for survival, for clarity, for your future. Because at some point you realize that real success doesn't need witnesses. The most powerful revenge isn't a fiery comeback speech. It's a quiet life built with discipline and intention. Epictetus would remind us, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. And that's exactly what you're doing. Every time you choose to grow in silence, you embody restraint, discipline, and clarity. You stop defending your worth. You start becoming undeniable. And yes, they will notice. They always do, not all at once, but in subtle, unsettling ways. Your transformation reveals itself. It shows in your posture, in the steadiness of your pace, and the calm on your face. It shows in the way you no longer flinch when they enter the room, in the way your smile feels genuine without needing their approval. Over time, they begin to realize they've lost access to a version of you they never truly valued. And here is where their pain begins. Not because you staged a dramatic scene, but because you made a quiet decision. The Stoic path doesn't just lead to self-mastery, it forces others to see the void they themselves created. Slowly, regret surfaces. They regret not your silence, but every careless action, every word, every dismissal that brought you to that silence. And you're too focused on your own path to care. You've tasted peace. You've felt the freedom of leveling up without dragging the past behind you. And now that you've experienced that kind of clarity, you refuse to go back. That's the beauty of the second move. The more you grow quietly, the less explanation you owe anyone. But there's another level. Because it's not only about what you stop giving others, your time, your attention, your availability. The deeper Stoic strength comes from what you stop feeling for them. The next silent move isn't just silence. It's emotional unavailability. And when that sets in, everything changes. Silent move 3. Become emotionally unavailable. There comes a moment when silence shifts from being a pause to being a permanent decision. It doesn't arrive with drama, nor does it make a loud announcement. It settles quietly, deliberately, like a door closing in slow motion. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself. You no longer rise to provocations. You've stepped out of the emotional boxing ring entirely, and people notice, especially the ones who once thrived on pushing your buttons, the ones who expected you to react on cue every single time. They sense it, not because you told them, but because your detachment makes their chaos echo louder in the absence of your participation. Epictetus would call this emotional sovereignty, the refusal to allow others to dictate your inner state. Most people live their lives handing out emotional access like free samples, reacting to every opinion, every criticism, every petty jab. But Stoicism teaches that true composure isn't suppression. It's regulation. It's the ability to see the storm and decide calmly, I will not become this storm. And in today's noisy, reaction-driven world, that choice is radical. Because when someone disrespects you, they expect a familiar script, the raised voice, the defensive text, the endless explanation. That reaction feeds them. It reassures them they still have power over you. But when you stop giving them that script, when you stay calm, when you vanish emotionally, the ground under their feet begins to shake. Understand this. Emotional unavailability doesn't mean you feel nothing. It means your emotions are no longer accessible to people who haven't earned the right to touch them. That's not cruelty. That's discipline. It's the deliberate reallocation of your energy. You no longer attend every argument you're invited to. You no longer waste explanations on people who never listened in the first place. This kind of detachment becomes both protection and transformation. Your lack of reaction forces others to face their behavior without the cushion of your emotional responses. And that is where Stoic philosophy becomes deeply personal. Epictetus reminded his students, we are not disturbed by things, but by the views we take of them. When you become emotionally unavailable, you haven't stopped caring about life. You've simply learned to care correctly. You no longer view their approval as necessary for your peace. Their insults don't cut the way they once did. Their opinions carry less weight. Why? Because you've shifted from seeking emotional justice to choosing inner justice. And nothing confuses those who mistreated you more than your quiet, unwavering calm in the face of their noise. This isn't just theory. Look at history. Princess Diana, in the later years of her life, stopped defending herself publicly. She stopped playing by the royal script. Instead, she disengaged from the dysfunction and poured her energy into a mission she chose for herself. Quietly, strategically, purposefully. She didn't seek revenge. She let her dignity speak louder than words. Her emotional unavailability wasn't weakness, it was clarity, it was power. The same culture that once exploited her vulnerability began to respect her stillness. That is the long game of withdrawal. Now ask yourself, how many times have you over-explained, overshared, or overreacted to people who never deserved that access in the first place? How much of your energy have you wasted trying to be understood by people incapable of truly seeing you? Stoicism offers the antidote. Remove the performance. Choose composure over chaos. The people who once pulled the strings in your mind can no longer do it. Not because they've changed, but because you've changed what you respond to. That's the evolution they never expected. They thought you would remain small, that your confidence depended on their approval. But when you become emotionally unavailable, you send a quiet message. I've outgrown this conversation. And while they gossip, provoke, or spiral in their own noise, you're building something deeper, something grounded, something no longer tethered to their chaos. And the more you invest in that quiet strength, the more their influence fades into the background. Not because you hate them, but because you've finally chosen to love your peace more. Epictetus would call this conscious control. Not control over others, but control over yourself. He taught that the only real freedom is the freedom of the mind. And when you stop letting others dictate your emotional state, when you can stand still while the world demands a reaction, you've already won. not in their eyes because they may never understand it, but in your own. You don't owe them your anger. You don't owe them your explanations. What you owe yourself is consistency. That is why this move matters so much. You don't need to block them with dramatic gestures. You don't need to curse to announce your detachment or to declare a grand goodbye. You simply remove your emotional labor from the equation. No one hears the door close, but eventually they feel the cold draft of your absence. And in that silence, your composure becomes the loudest response you've ever given. Once you've mastered that, it's time to go one step further. Emotional unavailability is powerful, but enforcing boundaries silently is what solidifies your transformation. This is where silence stops being a reaction and becomes a new standard. Silent move. 4. Enforce boundaries silently. There is a unique kind of power that comes from setting boundaries without ever announcing them. Not because you believe no one deserves clarity, but because those who truly care about you won't need endless explanations to respect your self-worth. The ones who guilt-trip you, push you, or demand justification, they are usually the very people who benefited from you not having boundaries in the first place. And when you finally draw the line, not with anger or noise, but with calm detachment, they feel it. When someone disrespects you, your first instinct is often to explain, to tell them how much it hurt, hoping they'll stop, hoping they'll finally see you differently. You crave their understanding. You want them to change. But that instinct, though deeply human, is also a trap, because it keeps you tethered to the very dynamic that drained you in the first place. Epictetus, master of detachment and dignity, would remind us that your peace doesn't require their permission. It only requires your decision. And the best decisions are made quietly. True boundaries aren't about teaching others. They're about teaching yourself what you will and will not allow. They're about protecting your energy as if it were sacred currency. You don't need to block every number or compose long messages that outline your pain. Instead, you stop engaging in ways that betray your own well-being. You stop replying to messages that always leave you diminished. You stop saying yes to people who never ask how you are. You stop pouring yourself into dynamics where your presence is only valued when it's convenient for them. This shift doesn't happen overnight. At first, they won't notice. They'll misread your silence as moodiness, as distance, maybe even as passive aggression. But slowly, steadily, the truth sinks in. It's not that you're punishing them. It's that you've recalibrated your standards, and they no longer meet them. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. Epictetus said, "No person is free who is not master of himself." And that is what silent boundaries teach you. They aren't about controlling anyone else. They are about refusing to expose yourself to ongoing disrespect. They are about choosing short-term discomfort now instead of carrying long-term resentment later. This is where many people confuse revenge with healing. They think cutting someone off is about teaching them a lesson, but Stoicism teaches the opposite. Revenge is emotional debt. It ties you psychologically to the very people who drained you. Every time you replay the offense, every time you crave for them to see your pain, you're still centering them. And that means you're still chained. Epictetus would urge you to let go. because revenge, even when it feels justified, is another form of bondage. Instead, align your actions with your values and move on. No closure required. No spectacle. No final lecture. Just exit the cycle, and when you do, life begins to shift. People who meet your new standards start appearing. The chaos that used to swirl around you begins to quiet. Your inner world grows sharper, more whole, because the energy you once wasted. Managing dysfunction is now redirected toward building yourself, of course. Some people will try to come back. They'll feel the absence. They'll notice what's missing. They'll wonder what changed. But by then, the gap between who you were and who you've become will be too wide for them to cross. Not because you are unforgiving, but because you have finally realized that your peace is sacred, and once you've enforced your boundaries with that kind of stillness and strength, you are ready for the final, most haunting move. Not just disappearing physically, but removing yourself emotionally and spiritually from the cycle altogether. Not with bitterness, but with grace. Not with noise, but with dignity. Because when you disappear with dignity, that silence becomes the final message, the one they feel long after you've gone. When someone continues to disrespect you, to test your limits, to ignore your value yet still expect your loyalty, the wisest response is not to fight, argue, or retaliate. The wisest thing you can do is leave. Not with a dramatic outburst, not with a grand exit filled with emotional speeches or fiery confrontations. No, you leave quietly, completely, and above all with dignity. Epictetus would call this the final act of self-respect, because when you walk away from a situation that continuously dishonors your worth, you are not running from anything. You are returning to yourself. The people who mistreat you depend on your presence. They rely on your predictable tolerance. They expect you to keep explaining, to keep trying, to keep caring. But Stoic wisdom reminds us that showing up again and again for those who refuse to value your effort is not compassion. It's self-neglect. At some point, your silence must become your boundary, not because you seek to punish them, but because you refuse to abandon yourself in order to keep the peace. Disappearing isn't petty. It isn't an act of cruelty. It is protection. It is how you reclaim your time, your focus, and your emotional capacity from relationships that only drained you without ever filling you. And here's what most people never expect. Your absence speaks louder than any speech you could deliver. While they anticipated a reaction, you gave them stillness. While they waited for an explanation, you offered none. That emptiness, that silence forces them to face their behavior in a way your words never could. They're left alone with the echo of their own actions, sitting in the empty space where your energy once lived. And in that space, the weight of loss settles in. Not because you shouted, but because you stopped showing up. Epictetus taught that we must never anchor our peace to things beyond our control. Not people, not closure, not even understanding. When you leave with dignity, you refuse to beg for resolution. You stop waiting for apologies that may never arrive. You stop clinging to the hope that one day they'll see your worth, because now you see it clearly for yourself. You no longer waste words trying to fix what you didn't break. You no longer explain what should have been obvious. You simply walk away, And this type of disappearance is not avoidance. It is discipline. It is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the conscious choice to end a pattern that has become toxic. It is the deliberate act of no longer participating in dynamics that insult your soul, choosing peace not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. The Stoics called this self-mastery, the ability to walk away from what doesn't serve your higher self, even if you once loved it deeply. At first, they may try to reach out, maybe not directly, but through vague messages, indirect comments, or through mutual connections. But by then, you've already outgrown the cycle, not from bitterness, but from clarity. You've built a life in which their dysfunction no longer has a place, and that, Epictetus would argue, is the ultimate freedom, not needing to punish, not needing to explain, simply removing yourself without guilt or noise. Eventually, they realize what they've lost. Your presence was never their right. It was a gift, and they lost it, not because of one moment, but because of repeated choices to dishonor it. The realization doesn't strike like lightning. It creeps in slowly when they notice your name no longer appears, when they realize your attention has moved elsewhere, when they feel the cold absence of your emotional investment. That is when the truth sinks in, not because you shouted, but because you left, and you left well. This is the final silent move, the one that completes the cycle of Stoic transformation. You've gone from tolerating to detaching, from reacting to rising, from explaining to enforcing, and finally from engaging to exiting. And when you leave, with dignity, calm, clear, and unbothered, you close a door that cannot be reopened. You don't leave behind confusion. You leave behind space for growth, theirs if they choose it. But most importantly, yours. Your disappearance was never about revenge. It was always about rebirth. As Epictetus taught, the greatest freedom lies in choosing what and who you allow into your peace. When you walk away from what wounds you, you walk directly toward what heals you. And those who once took your presence for granted will feel your absence more deeply than words could ever communicate. No arguments, no explanations, just stillness and strength. And in that silence, they'll finally understand they lost something rare. So remember this. The next time someone underestimates your value, you owe no one access to your soul. Let your silence be the loudest message they will ever hear. If this message has helped you see your worth more clearly, take a moment, hit that like button. Subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and share it with someone who is ready to rise quietly, powerfully, and on their own terms. And drop a comment below with these words: "My silence is my strength. From this point forward, you don't need to say a word. You are the message." If you had to choose just one silent move from this video to practice starting today, which would it be? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you're ready to master more strategies to stay calm, powerful, and untouchable, explore the StoicCraft playlist on inner strength. Your journey has only just begun.